I'd like to present to you Manny Cavalieri. I butchered that, right? Excellent. He'll tell you the correct pronunciation of his name in a minute. I'm still, soon going to learn how to deal with my failure. He's going to tell us a bit about making great calls. Take it away.
Hey, everyone.
Hi, Manny.
Hey.
Hi, Manny.
My name is Manny.
5 out of 7. What should...
Today, you're going to be learning how to make really awesome calls from this obnoxious loud schmuck with too much energy. He looks like this.
What is that?
And his name is Manny. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Manny. I like long walks on the beach, combo decks, bad puns, and telling stories. So if you see me at an event, or the next time you see me at an event for all these familiar faces, tell me a joke. I love jokes. They'll make me super happy. So, to drive those points home, let's start with the story. So, my first job was going door to door. So I was actually canvassing and raising money. I was going door to door and I would say, "Hi, my name is Manny. I'm with Kaladesh Citizens for Freedom. Did you know that the consulate imprisons 72 law-abiding citizens without trial each year?" And try to raise money for our cause. And then I would go, after giving my pitch, to the next door and I'd say, "Hey, my name is Manny," and I would get a door slammed in my face. And then I'd go to the next one with a black eye from where the doorknob hit me and say, "Hey, my name is Manny, and I'm with Kaladesh Citizens for Freedom." And I would do this over and over and over again. And what I want to tell, the reason why I'm telling this story, what I want to focus on is that pitch that I repeated each time. At our office, we actually called it the rap. And at the beginning of every day, regardless of how long everybody had been at that office for, we rehearsed the rap. We repeated it to each other verbatim. It was scripted. It was not something that we improvised or that we kind of picked up. There was a script that was written by professionals that was given to us. We had to memorize it. We repeated it to each other verbatim. We played all sorts of games. We passed balls to each other, and when you caught it, you had to say the next line of the rap wherever it was. By the end of the summer, I could say the rap backwards in Mandarin in my sleep. And the point of that, though, was not just that this was the perfect magical combination of words, that every time we said it to a door, money would flow out of the person and onto our clipboard. It was that this gave us a crucial piece of structure. It gave us something that we referred to. In fact, what I found out was that after a certain point, I stopped saying the rap verbatim and only ever said it exactly as it was written during those morning practice sessions. Each time I went to somebody's door, I would say something slightly different. And I would try to modulate that difference based on what I was seeing from that person. And I could do that because I'd committed that rap so thoroughly to memory. So that's a concept that I want to bring to talking about judge calls. So I want to give everybody a heads up. This is going to be a little bit of a dense presentation. There's going to be a lot of topics here. I'm going to try to move through them pretty quickly. So for the time being, try to hold your questions to the moment where I make noises at you that sound like I want you to make noises back. So we're going to be talking about what a judge call needs to be really great. Judge calls are kind of the most common skill set if you think about it. We've got judges who do all sorts of different things in the program, but the one unifying feature is that we all should be able to take to answer a question from a player and leave them feeling good about that and give them what they had asked for. So this is, on the one hand, the most universal trait that judges should have. But on the other hand, while the judge program is really excellent at passing around tips and things that people learned and best practices, in this one fundamental universal area, I didn't see that there was a ton of, to use kind of an academic term, theory. There wasn't a ton of, this is the basic approach to handling judge calls. There's a lot of, you want to make sure that you're polite. There's a lot of customer service. There's a lot of, like I said, tips and best practices. Lower yourself to eye level, use very friendly gestures, smile, etc. But not about just in principle, what should you be doing when you get to a judge call? What should you need to tell that person? What information should you be looking for them? We don't have the equivalent of the rap. So I want to kind of bring that to us. So when we talk about judge calls, just to lay it all out there, there's a bunch of different types. We've got rules clarifications. We've got players asking for oracle text. We've got an infraction occurred, or something broadly something went wrong, or maybe something went wrong and the players want our help. players maybe want us to look out for slow play or some other general comfort questions that the players may have. Or the players can say, can you take my match slip up? Which is not always our favorite of the judge calls. But what I'm going to focus most of the presentation on explicitly is when an infraction might have occurred, and that's not to the exclusion of other ones. That's just because this scenario, I think, has kind of the most depth. So if I want to give you a structured, comprehensive approach, this is the one with the most area to be comprehensive in. But I would like you to keep in mind that these concepts, I think, can be applied to any one of these interactions here and any other interactions you can have with players at an event, whether it's a large event, whether it's a small store event. So, in a nutshell, I think the essence of it, when we need to make these judge calls great, we need them to be correct, and we need them to be satisfying. All right, thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.
We still have a few minutes.
How many?
40.
Oh, okay. So, hey! My name is Manny. All right, so we need these calls to be correct and satisfying. And I like starting off with these two words here because they're not always the same, or they don't overlap as much as we think they do. So we usually think, like, was this judge call right? And we think about it as just one package. But we can have judge calls that are correct, that leave the players very unsatisfied. And we can have judge calls that we leave feeling great about it initially. The players were very satisfied, and then the first judge you talk to says, that's not how that should have happened. So, of these two, I think satisfying is actually the more interesting and nuanced one and the trickier one to address. So, of course, we're going to talk about that later and not right now. Let's focus on how to make them correct. So, let's go through what makes a judge call correct. Not overthinking this too much. On the most basic level, we need to be giving the right answer. For judge calls that are rules questions or that boil down to rules questions, there is only one and exactly one right answer. So we want to make sure that we know it and we give them that one right answer. If it's a policy question, especially at a larger event, or if it's a really strange scenario, then there might not be exactly one right answer. So we want to do the best we can. We want to act as though there is one right and just work towards the best possible one and give them that one. And we need to make sure that once we have that answer, though, that we explain it clearly. Because if we don't explain the answer clearly to the player, they can't actually use it. So it doesn't actually function to them as an answer, which is a very important point. So, of course, I'll get to it later. So how do we get to the right answer? Part of what got me thinking about putting this presentation together was working with several awesome judges at some really, really fun events. And I noticed that every now and then, scenarios that seemed simple, or maybe just seemed simple to me at the time, I would see the judges start with the right answer, but the wrong part of it. They would start with, for instance, well, I know this is a warning, and then try to figure out, wait, what actually went wrong? And this leads to them meandering through the call. This leads to them feeling uncertain because they are immediately aware of, I don't know something. And they start with, I know what the answer should be, but what's the rest of the work I need to show? And they get a little lost. And this makes them feel less comfortable. Or for more experienced judges, they start with, oh, I recognize this, and they say this, and then the player maybe says something that catches them a little bit off guard, and they don't know where to go from there. I think no matter how much experience any of us have had with judge calls, we've all had a situation that made us double check something, or that made us approach it slightly differently, or that we've walked away thinking, that should have been way faster than it actually was. So, first I want to ask you all a question. This is what a noise that invites other noise, it sounds like. Why do we have policy documents, just in general? What is the purpose of having policy documents, and why is it important that we use them and follow them at events? Yes?
So that my right answer is the same as Steve's right answer, is the same as Tom's right answer, is the same as your right answer.
Neat. And who are you?
I am Chris Wendelbro.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. So that you give the same answer, the same right answer as other judges. Anybody else want to elaborate? Yes, in the strike footy.
So that the information that we provide to players comes from a place of accurate authority, that they won't consider it to be a biased opinion on our part. We can actually back it up and say policy dictates that we do it this way.
Cool. And your name?
Joshua.
So Josh points out that we have an authority that we can back up, and we can avoid impressions of bias to players. One more. Yes?
The player experience across the board is going to be a similar situation. They are going to be confused whenever a different judge is giving something very similar, or giving something very wildly different for a similar situation that happened several weeks ago.
Very good. And your name?
Joshua Hudson.
Cool. All right, Josh number 2. So Josh number 2 points out so that players have a similar experience in different events and when interacting with different judges, which is similar to what Chris pointed out, and is also strengthening what Josh number 1 pointed out about giving the program in general this feeling of a lack of bias. What's coming up in each of these answers is consistency. So by relying on these documents, we're able to, as we've all said now, have or deliver consistent rulings from event to event and from judge to judge. So what I like to do is provide some structure to help you give consistent rulings within a ruling and from ruling to ruling for you, for one judge. So like any good snake oil salesman, I've got a super sweet 3-step plan that's going to help solve all your problems. And that 3-step plan is infraction, penalty, fix. And these are steps, which means they happen in order. So I'd like to start by saying for each of your calls where you are called over by a player to a table, think about these 3 steps first. This is the information you need. You will need to figure out what went wrong, what you should do about it, and then how to fix it. Now, some of you who have done several of these events may have recognized that this is terminology from the IPG, the Infraction Procedure Guide, and that particular policy document covers events at competitive rules enforcement level and higher. But for other events, for our FNMs, for our game days, for our pre-releases, we have this other document for judging at regular, also known as the JAR. But we still have these 3 steps. We don't have penalties in the JAR, or we don't have infractions in the JAR as such, but if you read the JAR, it's grouped into types of issues. Is this a common issue? Is this a serious problem, etc.? We don't give out penalties often, though that's an option to us for repeated issues, but we might have, like at our meanest, a finger wag, or just generally an instruction to be a little bit more careful, an educational moment. And of course, we still attempt to fix it. And again, these steps are sequential. Really, across all events between regular and competitive, the 3 steps boil down to what went wrong, teach the player to be a little bit more careful, and it's worth pointing out that this is part of what the penalties are there for. They're not to give you a slap on the wrist in case you were cheating and got away with it. They're there to emphasize that this is something that should not be repeated and call attention to it and help instruct the player to be a little bit more careful. And how do we fix it? What's the remedy? Now, this is the same universal one. I could have started with this, but it's really not as quick and punchy as infraction, penalty, fix. So I'm going to keep using these terms throughout the presentation. But I wanted this aside to point out that this is going to be true across all events. So I may speak to some scenarios that sound more like they're from the floor of an SCG Open or from a Grand Prix. But these also work, and I've seen them work at FNMs, at pre-releases, at 8-player PTQs on rainy weekdays. So that all said, let's take a breather. We've covered what makes it correct. We're not going to go into the details of how to memorize the rules and policy. I just want to point out these are the important things that you need to make sure you get and deliver to players in a ruling. You want to be able to think, what is the infraction? That leads you to, what is the penalty? That leads you to, what is the fix? So, having covered what sorts of things we need to worry about to make sure that calls are correct, how do we make sure that they are satisfying? There's a lot of things that factor into what makes a ruling satisfying for a player, including most obviously if the ruling goes well for the player. But I think in terms of the things that we can control in our interaction with the player as judges, there's one big thing. The thing that makes players most feel satisfied, or the thing that we're ultimately attempting to achieve, is this. We need to make sure the player feels addressed. All right, sorry. So, story time. I've made enough cheesy gags. Let's start with an actual concrete example from an event I was at recently. So we have a player who plays this super neat card, which hopefully you can all read if you don't recognize. And the important thing is that this is a creature that does something when it enters the battlefield, something very good. So the player casts this card, it resolves, it enters the battlefield, he passes the turn, the other opponent starts doing something, and then the player realizes he didn't get his 3 energy that he should have when this entered the battlefield. And so there's a dispute between the players and they call a judge. And the judge comes over and rules, as many of you will know, is this trigger missed?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, it was in this case. And so the judge says, well, yes, this trigger is missed. Your opponent has the option to put it on the stack or not. And the player says, well, no, I don't think that's right. It's not a may ability. And then the judge responds, and this is what makes this story, I think, very cool. The judge says, well, so the thing with may abilities that you're thinking of, they used to work like that. Back when Modo treated them that way. You had a choice for every trigger when you were resolving it in Modo, and the policy at tournaments matched that. But then they changed it, so online play was a little out of sync with policy. And then when they started having online events qualify for real-world events, that kind of messed things up. So they changed it back at first, but that messed with expectations. So eventually, and around this point, the player cuts in again and says, no, I don't think that's right. This isn't a may ability. And shortly after that, appeals the ruling. So, ignoring the fact that the player appealed the ruling, regardless of that fact, because that's not really a failure case that we need to worry about much, what's wrong with this ruling?
They didn't address the question.
Hands up. And what's your name?
My name is Zach, and they did not address the question.
Zach says they did not address the question in the black hoodie.
You said Modo.
Modo is
Modo
not
is the
magic.
correct
It's
answer.
the best interpretation they can do of magic on a client. It's a very poor one at that.
Alex notes his grievances with Modo and points out that the judge should not have mentioned it. Is there, on that note, is there any other reason why the judge should not have mentioned Modo? Yes.
Russell, because it's TMI.
Russell, because it's TMI, it's too much information. Let's think one more thing that hasn't been mentioned so far. What else went wrong with this ruling?
The judge hasn't explained that the may gives the option to the controller of the trigger, and hasn't explained that having missed it, policy allows the opponent to choose whether it'll go on the stack.
The judge has not explained the ultimate reasoning behind the ruling more.
Yeah.
And you are?
Steve.
Steve. Great. So these are all good points. So a little bit sneakily, I've seeded into all your brains of what you have mentioned is going to be things that I'm going to touch on, and I'm going to break them down. And since I mentioned I have such a big affinity for structure, I'm going to put this in, this time, not into 3 steps, but you get a bonus step, 25% more for free. So we're going to do, and yes, I know that's not how the math works out. But you've got to admit that voice was pretty smooth. So there's going to be 4 things that I want to cover. I want to make sure that we match your answer to their questions. We want to make sure that you understand and meet the player's expectations with your answer. You want to keep in mind the player's level of familiarity with what's going on, both what they're asking about and what's going on around them. And you want to let them participate in the ruling. And with all these powers combined, you are Captain Judge ruling. And we'll leave the player feeling a lot safer and a lot less likely to litter. So let's start with that first one, matching your answer to their question. I mentioned earlier that it's important when you have the correct answer to give that, to clearly address that answer, to clearly deliver that answer and make sure that the player understands it. And I said that part of the reason for this is that if the player, if you don't explain it clearly, they don't know that you've actually given them the answer they need. Even if you have, and even if you've given them something that is technical, correct, thorough, tells them what they need, and teaches them a little bit more, if you didn't explain it clearly or didn't make sure that you've let them know that you've given them what they need, then they won't know. So if a player asks you for something and they get an answer that they don't know is the answer to their question, then they will repeat their question, or they will phrase it a different way but say the same question, or they'll just silently feel confused and a little silly and kind of languish there. We need to make sure that we let them know that we understood their question, understood what they are trying to achieve, and are giving them something that is what they are looking for. So when I say matching your answer to their question, that is ultimately what I'm talking about. You need to make sure that you let them know that you are giving them what they are asking for and that you have understood what they are asking for. So what are some easy ways to do this? Here's some quick tips. Include their question in your answer. This is helpful also because it lets you restate the question just to make sure that you understood it correctly in the first place. So if they spend entirely too much time asking you basically, I just cast this creature, can it crew my smuggler's copter? Then instead of just saying, yes, try saying, yes, that creature you just cast can crew the smuggler's copter. It shows them that you've understood all the factors that they were worried about, that they were concerned about, and that you're giving them an answer to that question. Use the terms that they used. So use the same or similar phrasing that the player used back in their answer. If a player asks you about a spell that no longer has a legal target and says, does it fizzle? Try not to answer with, yes, the spell is countered upon resolution. because if the player isn't familiar with those terms, they don't know that you've answered their question. Say, yes, the spell fizzles. Respond directly to the question that was asked. So the scenario we just talked through earlier, and a couple of you mentioned it, is a great example of that, because the judge was giving some information that honestly was really cool, that I didn't know. I learned something from that ruling. But the player didn't learn what they were asking for. And also, as this example showed, if you focus on responding directly to the question that they answered, it can help you stay more concise and have shorter, more satisfying, more expedient rulings, which is definitely something also that players will appreciate. So, in this case, for instance, the judge could have simply mentioned, even though it's not a may ability, this trigger is still missed, which is a very succinct way to say, I'm talking about what you just said. You said may ability, which is not a rules term, but I'm using the phrasing you used. And I'm saying, even though blah, answer. I'm showing you that I've understood your question, and I'm responding directly. Now let's talk about expectations. Expectations is fairly straightforward. We want to make sure we match them, and we're talking about expectations we're looking for are, does the player think that they know the answer? Which is helpful because then you should address what they think they know the answer is, both to confirm it if it's right, or to explicitly call it out if it's wrong. Otherwise, we're in another case where it's not clear to them that you've given them the answer. And just more generally, what do they expect is going to happen? And this is not just talking about a rules interaction, but just what do they expect is going to happen as a result of you showing up to the table? Do they expect that their opponent is going to get a penalty? Do they expect that they're in trouble? Do they expect that they're going to have a very friendly conversation about why something works? So, how do we gauge a player's expectations when we show up, and how do we address them? And how do we do this quickly and kind of almost silently, just sneakily? Pay attention to whether the player's questions are open or closed. That will help drive whether you should be using explanatory or concise language. Respond directly to what they said. This is just another elaboration of what we said earlier. And if you know what their expectations are, you can prepare if the player is going to have a certain emotional response. And I don't mean here like an overblown hysterical emotional response, but I mean simply even something as banal as just simple disappointment. If you notice that the player was not aware that hidden card error is now how we're resolving certain infraction, or that the hidden card error fix is going to be how we're resolving certain infractions, then they're in for a potentially very nasty surprise when they have to reveal more cards to the opponent. So being aware of that helps you make sure that you address their expectations and can be more comforting, adjust your language, adjust your explanation accordingly. I want to focus on this concept of open or closed questions, though, because we're going to use it a couple more times, and it's a really neat idea. It's pretty straightforward. So, open versus closed questions. And I'm going to say up front and then repeat at the end, this is not about good versus bad questions, but it's about being aware of how these questions are shaping the conversation. So when I say an open question, I'm talking about a question that is open-ended. It is non-specific. It's an invitation. If you think about the question like priority, it is passing priority. You now get to add objects to the conversation. In general, the idea behind an open question is that it is an inquiry. It is an open, broad request for information. Some examples of open questions might be, what are you up to tonight? How can I help you? What happens next? Can I get one or two more examples of open questions? Yes?
How did the game state get here?
How did the game state get here? Good one. Your name?
Brian.
Brian, thank you. Another one, someone I haven't heard from yet. You.
What's happening to this creature?
What's happening to this creature? That's a very good one. And what was your name?
Ashley.
Ashley, thank you, Ashley. By contrast, closed questions. Closed questions are not as open-ended because they suggest the answer to the question within the question itself. They're specific. They're asking you to confirm or deny something, which is a lot of words to say that they're almost always yes or no questions, and that yes or no questions are closed questions. Unlike an inquiry for information, they're a request, such as, did you like the movie? Is it too late to crew my vehicle? Can I spell skite that? I love that one because that is a closed question, and we tend to give very open answers to that one frequently. We'll get back to that one in a moment. So going back to this, how does the idea of open or closed questions really, really matter here? Well, if you hear open questions, you can respond with explanatory language. If you come to a table and a player asks, as Ashley suggested, what's happening to this creature? You can then explain, okay, so what's going on here is, and even before explaining what it is, you've already used language that's indicating, all right, I'm going to respond by telling you more. You've requested a bunch of information, and I can walk you through it. Whereas if the player had just asked, does my creature die? And you start saying, okay, so what's going on here is, then you're not necessarily going to annoy the player. Players are going to react to this sort of stuff all sorts of different ways. But you might, or the ruling might simply be less concise than it could be, and therefore less expedient and comfortable, and slightly less satisfying to the player. Whereas if they're asking you closed questions like, does it die, you can be more concise and respond directly to what they're asking for. Yes, it dies. Which is also, even though it's very few words, is also repeating their question back to them, like we mentioned earlier about matching your answer to their question. And again, you can make sure to prepare for any emotional response that the player may have. Let's talk about familiarity. This is fairly straightforward. It's what you think it means. It's how familiar is the player with what's going on. How much do they know? To put into more specific terms, how much do they know about the rules? How much do they know about policy? Like this clueless person who didn't even know a picture was being taken. Or this guy who's clearly never played an event before. Where's his playmat? What's this guy up to? So, how do we assess familiarity here? What terminology is the player using? If a player shows you a card like Green Sun Zenith, which is a spell that shuffles itself back into a library as part of its resolution and says, can I miss this trigger? That tells you something. That tells you that they know about triggers, but that they don't know enough to recognize the keywords that indicate them. When you respond to them, try to avoid using shorthand. Always. Even if the player uses shorthand, if you can, without over-elaborating, respond without using the exact same shorthand. If the player says, oh, so this is AppNap, right? Try, in that case, not to respond with, this is AppNap, say, yes, the active player, and then the non-active player. Why, in this case, as opposed to you matching their terminology earlier, why, in this case, am I suggesting to avoid using shorthand? Yes?
So that if the opponent doesn't know the shorthand, they will understand it well.
Beautiful. I always write this presentation like it might take us a couple of questions, but everybody gets it on the first try. It's exactly correct. There's two players at the table, even though one of them has called you over there. And your name?
Paul Reisinger.
Paul. Thanks, Paul. So, lastly, what familiarity is really about is about addressing their knowledge base. You want to make sure that you're responding to them in terms that they understand and providing them information that they can use. I was on the floor of another large event, and I was passing by a call that I was not shadowing, and I heard the following sentence from a judge at the table. First off, what was it? First off, damage doesn't kill creatures, state-based actions do. Why did that make you guys laugh right now? How do we know that something's amiss immediately?
That's probably not relevant.
That's probably not relevant. Would it make you laugh even more if I told you that this was at an F&M? And that is because the players that we're likely to see an event like this are probably not going to have a knowledge base where they'll appreciate that information, in addition to it's definitely not germane to whatever the question was at this limited F&M. So let's talk about that spell scat question. Everyone's favorite card. So let's say that a player calls you to the table, asks to speak to you away from the table, and asks, can I spell scat that? Let's say for what it's worth, that they're talking about is the activated ability of their opponent's Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker. So, for those that haven't committed these cards to memory, Kiki Jiki says target non-legendary creature you control, so your opponent's spell scat will not ultimately be able to redirect that. Knowing that, what do you need to know to answer this question, to answer this player's question? So they've shown you the opponent's Kiki Jiki, they hold up their spell scat secretly, clandestinely, and say, can I spell scat that? Yes.
What their expectation of the result, what they think is going to happen.
What they think is going to happen. Your name?
Joshua.
Joshua number 3. Oh boy. Joshua number 3 says we need to double check, or we need to find out what the player's expectation is. Joshua number 3, how would you do that? Give me an example of how you would ask the player.
So they're asking, can I spell scat that? What do you think is going to happen if you do?
All right. Someone.
Sorry.
No worries. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Just directly ask them, what do you think is going to happen before I answer?
Very good. I love being direct with the players and just bringing it out there. I saw another hand from over here. I'm going to point at Jonah. Jonah, please tell us your name.
Jonah?
Cool. Jonah, what information do you need to know to be able to answer this player's question?
I want to know what sort of answer the
Mm-hmm.
but I can't. They don't want a yes/no answer because it's not the information that they're looking for. Most likely.
That's a very interesting point. So when you say that's not the information they're looking for most likely, you seem to be touching on, Jonah, that there's a question that they're asking and that the answer that you think you should give doesn't match that question.
Yes.
What question matches your answer? So for instance, if they say, can I spell Skype that? What is the question you think that they really should have been asking or are not aware that they are actually asking?
Will the ability be redirected if I spell Skype?
All right. So this is, I think, a very interesting point here because this is an example that gets talked about a lot. And this is kind of the consensus reading of that, is that the player is really asking, will this sequence of the stack resolve in a way that changes the target of Kiki Chiki's ability? And I want to push back against that a little bit and say that that's not what the player is really asking. The player is really asking, can I spell Skype that? And you need to understand what the player thinks that means, not what the rules can answer from your familiarity. So you should try to figure out what the player's understanding of that actually is in a little bit more detail. And that will tell you a little bit more if they understand, for instance, the distinction between targeting it with spell Skype and what will happen when it resolves. I've seen a very popular answer to this question be, can I spell Skype that? You may target that with spell Skype. What's one problem with this answer?
It assumes that you know what the player is asking you.
Sure. Could you elaborate on that? And your name?
Elliot.
Elliot?
If you're providing an answer that is not what the player's expecting to hear, so they're going to ask you a follow-up question, or if they don't, then you are now providing information that you don't know if that player actually has.
Very good. We've got a bunch of hands. Let's go for here in the gray.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the complicated problem is you're going to give the player the answer they want to hear, at the same time the answer they don't want to hear. So yes, you can target the ability with spell Skype, but it won't work because Kiki Jiki requires that you own whether you control the other creature.
Yep, very good. I think we're all hitting on kind of a similar thing, which is if you say that sentence, yes, you can target it with spell Skype's ability, the player is not going to interpret it in the way that you actually mean it. The player is likely to interpret it as, this will do what I want it to. I think we're going to move on for this one, but the spell Skype example is fertile grounds for, and I don't have the card image for another pun, apologies, for more discussion, which if we have time we'll get to later. So let's move on and talk about why my clicker isn't working. Neat. Nope, we're back. Exciting. All right, so let's talk about participation. And by participation, I don't mean an award you get just for showing up. I mean, how do we make sure that the player gets to be a part of the ruling? Now, right off the bat, there's one way that we always get players to participate, which is just they need to tell us what they need. But we can elaborate on that a little bit more. We can make sure that we are genuinely inviting them to help us get the information they need. Now, again, what is the information we need? Well, if you cast your minds far back to those forgotten times covered in the ash heap of history of earlier this presentation, the information we need is... One more time, everybody. Come on. Let's do it. Bingo. You need to figure out what went wrong. Then in your own head, you need to discover what, if any, penalty or other remedial things you need to do, and what is the fix here. So, invite the player to give you that information. Use open questions to fill in gaps. In fact, I'm a big fan of when you show up to the table, your first question should be an open one. Even if the player asked you something very, like if the board state is complicated or has more than just the 2 cards on it that they're asking about, and the player asks you some direct question, feel free to say, okay, why don't you walk me through what's going on here? Remember that the point of these open questions is to gain information. And when you show up at a ruling, no matter what the ruling is and no matter what the player says to you, you don't know what information there is out there that you need. You don't know what you're missing when you show up at first. So you want to get as much as you can, and you want to make sure that it's the player who's giving that to you so that you don't overlook anything that the player feels is important or germane to the situation or anything that would help make them feel more addressed. we're very good at asking closed questions, like whose turn is it? And we start, as we get more comfortable with rulings, to just look for the specific pieces of information that we think we need and starting with closed questions. And I would like us to instead try starting with more open questions. It's going to make the player feel a little bit more involved and get to feel like they're participating in the ruling. And it's also going to help make sure you don't miss things as much. That said, closed questions still have a use. Once you've gotten that information, if you want to repeat the information back to the player to make sure you've understood the ruling, closed questions. You're not going to ask them again, all right, so just to confirm, why don't you walk me through a second time? Players are unlikely to respond well to that because I've given you a lot of information. But now you're retaining priority here. You're asking them if your answer can resolve. You're saying, all right, so it's his turn and he cast that targeting this, correct? And what I just did there was getting sign-off from the player at the end. Get them to buy in. This sounds like it's like sneaky or like some legal move, but what this is just doing is it's making sure that the player confirms to you that they're giving you everything that they think is important here. And this is important for the player. It's not just a cheesy way of saying like, all right, once I say this, haha, I've tricked you and now the ruling is this. It's making sure that the player is volunteered and feels to themselves that they volunteered everything that you should know to make the ruling. And repeat this for the opponent if needed. Don't forget that the opponent is still there, as we pointed out earlier, and that they're also involved in the ruling. So if the opponent has just been very cooperative and the scenario seems simple, you can use some very quick closed questions to just get back to, all right, so, and do you agree that this is targeting that? But make sure to involve the opponent as well. And you're going to do this all up front, and by up front I mean before you deliver your ruling. Before you deliver your ruling. Even if the ruling is simple and you know the answer. Even if it's very simple and you already know the answer, confirm with the players. It'll make sure that you don't miss anything, at least from their perspective. There's always a chance that they forgot to mention something because we're all only human. But it gives them that last chance to say, okay, it's what's going to happen next is I'm going to give you the ruling or the answer to your question. And I want to make sure that I have everything I need from you and that you are all on board with the information you've given me so far. So that's participation. So this has been a ton of talking, and I've just mostly been blabbing at you. So we're going to try to put it all together, right? We've been talking about matching your answer to their question. We've been talking about addressing their expectations, checking their level of familiarity, and getting them to be involved in the ruling. And the information we need is infraction penalty fix. So for now, let's talk about how do we get all of the information we need. And I'd like to try to step through a ruling. Now, this is not going to be full-on role-playing. I want to leave that to Judge Calls Live. And if any of you are going to be in any of those sessions, I'd really be curious to see if you try some of the things from this presentation in Judge Calls Live and see if that changes how you would have thought to approach that. But so with that in mind, we've got a couple of different examples that we can walk through. I either have a couple that I prepared, or if anybody here has a ruling that they thought could have been done better, and they can repeat the question the player asked without a big explanation of board state, we could go off that. So does anybody have a ruling that they think they can articulate in 3 sentences? Going once. Going only once. All right. So let's say you get called over to a player in Kaladesh Sealed. The player is attacking with 4 creatures. Doesn't matter which ones they are. The blocking player has 1 creature on the battlefield, and it happens to be lined up with one of the 4 creatures. Oh no! And it happens to be lined up with one of the blocking creatures. Almost as though it were blocking, but nothing, it hasn't been moved, it just happens to be there. The blocking player flashes in Torrential Gearhulk, puts it on the battlefield in front of another creature, looks through their graveyard, picks up an instant that will return a creature to its controller's hand, and is holding it in their hand and is surveying the opponent's board. And this is all happening silently. And the opponent says, so those are blocks? And the player holding that instant in their hand says, yeah, by reflex. And then announces what creature they'd like to bounce with that instant, and a judge is called. So let's walk through how we would try to approach this ruling with the structure that we described here. So we need to figure out this information. So let's start with that. First off, from everybody here, what is the infraction penalty fix? And let's get one person for each. Oh, really? At least one of you knows what infraction, if any, has been committed here. Yeah, there we go.
Charlie, the infraction is that you're moving to another step, to a block step, without identified what he's targeting in terms of the gear hulk. So the other player had asked for passing priority ahead of sequence, essentially.
Yep, that's pretty much exactly where I'd be at. So we can't move to blockers yet because we've acknowledged that we're in the process of resolving Torrential Gearhulk's ability, as best as we can tell. Is there any penalty here? Assuming that this is at competitive? Am I getting shaking heads, or does someone want to raise their hand and put a name to the shaking head? Hey there,
I'm
Zach.
Zach, and I will say no. I believe there is no penalty.
Cool, I would agree with that. And I'm being real stickler about this because part of how we make sure that we ingrain this habit is by actually going through it every time. It's going to feel cheesy and corny the first several times, kind of like those first several times I was going through the rap each morning and repeating it verbatim. Rolling gear, everybody rolls their eyes the first several times. And then we all memorize it and can use it much better than everybody else. All right, and the fix before we move on too quickly. Yes, in the back.
I just have a question about this in general.
Sure.
So if the players continue to disagree on what's going on,
Mm-hmm.
would it be a communication violation?
That's an interesting question. I want to throw it back to the audience a little bit first. So the question asked here is, if the opponent disagrees on what's going on here, disagrees on this telling of the story, is it possible that we have a communication policy violation here? Elliot.
It's very unlikely that this is a communication policy violation because nothing has necessarily been misrepresented at the game state. It's just someone trying to move the game along. No free or derived information has been misrepresented in any way. So I wouldn't say that this is CPV.
Cool. Could everyone hear that? Neat. Does anyone want to add to that? One more.
Just because an infraction seems like it's going to have like a nesting involvement of communication does not necessarily mean that the communication is the root of where our problem lies.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Going back to this model, remember that these, I keep putting the numbers on them because they happen in this order. And you should think through them in this order. So the infraction here is not necessarily that there was this miscommunication, but ultimately we need to correct where we are in the game state. We can't move to blockers until we finish resolving this ability, and this ability is in the process of resolving. Fundamentally, that's what's going on. All right, so.
Sorry. If there's no infraction and they go in order, how do you have a fix?
So this order is the things that you need. Now, the things that you need to know. If you want to think of it this way, the things that you need to know is a whether or not in front of each of them. So there might not be any infraction each time you get called to the table, but you need to figure out if there is, and if so, which one it is. Similarly, you need to know what penalty it is, if there is one, and what fix there is, if one applies here at all. And the reason why they're in this order is because that's the order what determines if there is one or not. For instance, if you get to the table and you determine that there is no infraction that was committed, you know that there's no penalty. Whereas if you get to the table and it seems messy at first, you want to say like, I want to fix this. You're starting at the back, and you're going to kind of meander through the ruling and may end up giving a different ruling that you would have given in another situation. Does that answer your question, Russell? Yes. Great. See, I made him feel addressed. And now he's happier. So we want to figure out the ruling. So let's say we get called over to the table and we see these blockers. Who wants to tell me what they would say first to the players when they show up to the table? Yes.
Can you step me through what's happened?
Sure. So he just cast this Torrential Gearhulk. I'm attacking. And so he put it down, looked like he was blocking this. And I said, are those your blocks? And he said yes. And now he's trying to bounce something with this instant from the Gearhulk's ability.
Have you resolved Torrential Gearhulk's ability yet?
It's a great question. And what I like about that question is that, well, let's skip over ahead a little bit about this question. Using blue from my earlier slides, that's a closed question. So now we have a specific piece of information that we're looking for. So we're switching over to clarify there. But going backwards for a moment. So you've gotten the answer from the player. Going back to our structure, we should be looking out for what are their expectations. So what do you think, from what I just said, what does this player expect to happen? Yes.
It sounds like he might expect that his opponent has missed the Gearbolt trigger and has gone to blocks, and he wants to not have his opponent get that trigger.
All right. So Steve here says that it sounds like this player expects that the trigger is missed. That segues into the next thing we should be looking at. How familiar do you think this player is with what's going on? Can you point out some things that you know that this player knows from how they answered this question?
I clearly know something about when the trigger will become missed, because it seemed like he knows that the Gearhulk has a trigger, and then he deliberately asked that question of blocks.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to push his opponent past that, so he clearly has some knowledge of how this trigger policy would work.
Josh 3 has raised a number of things. One, this player has some awareness of the existence of missed trigger policy, and Josh is also now reading into what the player, going back to expectations, what the player was attempting to do, or what the player's intentions were in the sequence of events, which is a ton of information that we don't necessarily become consciously aware of the fact that we get just from that one sentence that the player gave us. There were more hands up. Yes?
So when you explained this the first time, you were like saying how the guy like pointed to something like in his graveyard, and the opponent asked, "Are these blocks?" And he said yes. So the way that I've had a very similar issue like this come up when I was playing a match at Grand Prix a few weeks ago, where the way that Torrential Gearhulk works is it's a may cast it, so maybe they remembered the trigger, but it is like timing restricted when you need to cast it. So they could have went to blocks and they would have forfeited the opportunity to cast the spell at that point. So they remembered the trigger, but maybe chose not to cast the spell. The opponent's trying to like lock them into that choice of not casting as going to blocks is something they could not have done by not casting.
Reasonable.
So it may not be a mistrigger.
That's a very good point. We have someone over here who'd like to say something about that, it sounds like.
Something to that extent.
All right.
It seems like the player in a situation who is trying to get the opponent to move past the point where the Torrential Gearhulk trigger could resolve in the way that they want it to is potentially more aware of priority than the opponent maybe.
This is
to the extent that they're aware how the stack works, they're aware of when that trigger can and cannot resolve, and when it cannot resolve the way their opponent wants them to, and maybe using that as an advantage of sorts to not so much rope the opponent into missing a trigger, but to use their knowledge of the rules as an advantage to get their way.
So look how much information, once we're stopping and thinking about it, we're drilling in. We now have, for a person that I've said 2 sentences to represent to all of you, we have a narrative for what this person is like. If I had to ask you, has this person played at a competitive REL event before? I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Have they played at many competitive REL events before?
Probably.
So we're getting an idea for how familiar they are with how these things are likely to go. We're getting a narrative for why the player did what they did. I want to go back to what Alex raised in the back there about whether or not this is a missed trigger or not, based on, well, there could have been a sequence of events in which the trigger was or was not missed. So we would need more information there. This goes back to the point earlier of make sure to involve the opponent. So in the answer that I gave to Josh number 2 earlier, the player responding didn't say anything about the fact that the opponent picked up a card in the graveyard and started looking around in it. This is a piece of information that is relevant to us, and so this is part of why, even if we hadn't noticed that the player was doing something different than was described, we can catch just by confirming with the opponent and saying, hey, so is that what happened? And even just looking at them to confirm is going to point us out or call our attention to the fact that they're holding a card, and we should know why. What is that card? When did you pick it up? And that's going to help us figure out what actually went on here. So this is what we picked up. We wanted to confirm the player's involvement. We wanted to get their participation. Again, this is reiterating what I said earlier about making sure you get their sign-off, repeating the story back to the players. We had a question in the back earlier about players not agreeing on the story. And this is where this would come up. So when we repeat the story back, we find these disagreements, and then I would suggest that if they come up here, this is where we work through them. So this is where we want to make sure that if the players give you different versions, you then figure out, okay, now I know which areas I need to focus on to get agreement from both players, and this is what I need to resolve before I can move forward. So you asked some, as I pointed out earlier when we skipped ahead a bit, we asked some closed questions. Why do you think he's holding that card as an example of an open question versus a closed question of did he pick up that card when he played the Gearhulk? Did he announce Gearhulk's trigger? Did he say blocks beforehand? These are all sorts of closed questions that can help clarify exactly when a certain sequence of events happened. So now, once we've gathered all this information, presuming that we don't have a big fight that we need to separate the players with, we have this information that we need. We've absorbed it into our judgely brains. So now the next thing we need to do is deliver the ruling. And for delivering the ruling, when most people talk about taking calls, they like to focus on this area. But I've saved it for the end here because I think it's actually the simplest one, and it doesn't actually need to be over-explained, at least within the context of this structure. Because when you're delivering the ruling, you're just giving them back the information that you've processed. So you've front-loaded all the work and done all of the involvement with the players now. Now you know infraction, penalty, fix. And you have a structure that you can go back to and that you can repeat the information in that structure. I mentioned the wrap at the beginning, and I mentioned that I would go door to door and adjust it slightly based on what each person said. And that's something that you can do once you've gathered all that information up front and carry it with you. For instance, with the wrap, I would always pause after saying, "Hi, I'm Manny, and I'm with Kaladesh Citizens supporting Renegades or for the Gatewatch." And I would put an extra pause there. And I would try to read if that person is sympathetic to the Renegade cause or if they're just an unthinking consulate autocrat. Because based on that, I can figure out how I should next approach it. And I have that ability because I know exactly what comes next. Similarly, when you start actually delivering the ruling, if the player starts getting more insistent on something or is upset or is surprised by this, you know exactly what comes next, and you can adjust how you're going to say it based on their reaction. So you just deliver that information in the same order. You say, okay, well, so there's no infraction here. We need to finish resolving this ability. You explain why. You explain that there's no penalty. Going back to the structure, always make sure that you don't overlook things, so that you don't forget to mention there's a warning for this, and what the fix is. And as you do so, again, going back to that thing that I mentioned at the beginning, respond in the terms that they're familiar with, respond in terms that they've used, match their level of understanding of the situation, of policy involved, and just overall make sure that you match your answers to their questions. That is how you make them feel addressed. Sorry, that's the last one. So, that was a ton of talking. That's it for me. For real this time?
I mean, our wrap-up is at noon.
Sweet. So I actually don't have any more gag fake-out slides. This is actually it now. So for now, I'd like to open it up. There were a bunch of different questions. What do people want to elaborate on? Do people want to talk about specific scenarios? Anything and everything. Let's start with Ashley again.
So for the Gearhall question,
Sure.
what the actual ended up fix was that, if I'm understanding correctly, they haven't actually moved because they can't move, and so there's no GRV, and so they're still in the declare attackers.
Correct.
Okay.
And we're in the process of resolving the Gear Hulk's ability. For those curious, that is the way that I ruled. It was appealed and upheld. Yes?
With this example and some others, what do you do, or I guess how do you lead the judge ruling when you sense that there's malintent on the player? For example, you have two players.
Mm-hmm.
One is very familiar with the rules.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually trying to kind of bully the other player to move to blocks because they'd like them to miss the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
You as a judge can kind of tell that, but the rhetoric is still civil enough that that's not necessarily apparent. Now, at the end, after you try to address what they're, what they want and their expectations, the malintent player obviously didn't get what they wanted. If
Mm-hmm.
let's say, rule in favor, and they have a certain expectation that's going to go a certain way because they are more familiar with the events and taking advantage and exploiting the situations.
Mm-hmm.
So, have you encountered that? And if you have, like, what usually happens?
I saw a hand go up immediately. I'd like to get some other people before I offer something there. Tom?
Yeah. So first, if I completely butcher what you were talking about, just tell me and I'll shut up. So I think we have to be careful as judges in these situations to punish people who have a strong familiarity of how the rules work. At competitive REL specifically, players should be rewarded for their knowledge of rules, right? So let's be careful to confuse malintent with advantage-based information. Like, at a tournament, if I feel like I can use my knowledge of the rules to a legal extent to gain an advantage that would, win me a match, sure, I'm going to do it. Now, if you think there's a line where a player is trying to commit an infraction that would warrant further investigation, sure, I would recommend going down the route that you may have proposed.
Right here, we were talking about a mistrigger, let's say solitary confinement.
Sure.
The player purposely didn't pitch a card. They also chose not to draw, so they're aware of the solitary confinement's there at the outcome.
Yep.
But they wanted the protection from the card.
I think in these situations, there's a line you toe. And as a judge, you have to be a little subjective with that.
So I'd like to build on that and then get some more participants in there briefly. So you mentioned a couple of different possibilities for intentionality here, one of which is actual cheating. And so I want to point out that this structure is not separate from investigations, but it's part of what informs the investigations. So in this case, the player's familiarity and their expectations are telling you about whether or not they are attempting to cheat. If you sense that a player has some very strong expectations and that they have familiarity such that this is likely what they are attempting to do and why, you now understand why you should look further, and you understand what you're trying to confirm as well. You're trying to confirm that those are their expectations, that they are that familiar, and that that is what they're trying to do, among other things. If they are just trying to get an outcome and trying to just strong-arm somebody unsportsmanly but not disqualifiably, you can moderate your response accordingly. I have something else to say about unsatisfied players there, but there are other hands that I'd like to get to. Steve, and then I saw someone here in the middle.
One of the things is I think sometimes it's good to just ask the player, like, what do you think was happening? So, for example, in this case, that might be a question you talk him away from the table, but you say to him, like, figure out, does he actually think that the player has missed his trigger, or is he trying to get the player to miss the trigger? And that's one of those things where you can kind of engage the intent, and then from there, you can, depending on how sketchy or cheaty they are, you can either, go down the investigation route, or you can be like, come on, man, and they'll be like, yeah, okay, and like, you
let it go.
You let it go, but you also get them back on track to like, okay, like, yeah, I was kind of rushing him, and they're more on board with the, getting to where they're supposed to be.
Yeah, it's sportsmanship versus a cheating.
Yeah.
Obviously missing a trigger.
Yep. Russell.
Being a judge in Brooklyn, I think, is very interesting because you get a very different demographic from normal FNF. There are some people that are more spiky than usual. When I show up to judge an event, I actually bring two judges with me. Not actually in person. What I mean is there's two of me. There's nice guy judge, and then there's shut that ish down judge. So, and you have to be in a situation where you feel as though the player's trying to run over your ruling. You need to be able to shift gears very quickly and say, this is not the game we're playing. If you want, the word game tournament is next week.
Nice.
Now we're playing Magic, and I just made my ruling.
Yep. And what Russell is also demonstrating here, if I may, is also that once he realizes that the player's expectations for the outcome are in a certain place, and the player has a certain emotional investment in that outcome, he is responding accordingly. Not just based on also what the player wants and giving them what the player wants, but in terms of what needs to happen in order to successfully conclude the ruling and move on with the rest of the game, match, and event. Yes. Does somebody have their hand up that I hadn't called out before? I got you, Josh, too. Let's go back there.
I was going to say, just overall for the ruling, we as humans tend to listen to respond, not listen to understand. As a judge, it takes our mind to shift gears a little bit, because when we respond to a ruling, we first have to understand to respond. So that's also the important part about understanding, collecting the information, to see how everything goes. Because in order to respond, we need to understand first as well.
I want to reiterate something that Brian mentioned there because it's very important, this idea of we frequently listen to respond, which is very, very true. And this goes back to the idea of closed and open questions. At the risk of sounding like I'm selling my snake oil real hard, as an exercise, try in the next couple of conversations or judge calls if you just want to keep it within judging. Try to pay attention to how many of your questions are closed versus open. And you may be surprised by just how lopsided the ratio is, and pretty universally across many different communication styles. Do people want to discuss a little bit more about this ruling? I want to cap off then. You mentioned the player is trying to get something, and we know we're not going to give it to them, and this is going to leave the player to being not fully satisfied. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that contributes to whether or not they're satisfied is whether they get what they want, obviously. Much like we could run the smoothest event, but if the player goes 0-2 drop to two terrible matchups, they're going to have a crappy day. there are some of these factors that we don't control, but we can do the most we can. Going back to this idea of there isn't always one exactly correct answer for policy questions, but we find the best possible one. We try to make the most satisfying possible situation. And in cases where the ruling is starting to drag on, we feel like we've achieved what we needed to, and we need to make sure that the match and therefore the event resumes, we can always offer the player to feel more addressed outside of this ruling. We can do that by offering to talk to them after the match, for example. We can say, this is the ruling. If you'd like, I can get the head judge for an appeal, but otherwise I need you to resume the match. And if you want, we can discuss this more after the match. And then whether or not they see, then it's up to them if they feel like there's still something missing that they want to kind of redress with you. And that will give them more opportunities to feel addressed, to feel like they get that one-on-one time with you. Frequently what I found, if you have the time to give to them, if you have just a long enough conversation with a player and are able to just keep your cool and continue addressing them throughout it, no matter how much they disagreed with you at the front, by the end of it, they'll be much more level and much more on your side. Because after a certain point, they just don't feel unaddressed. They don't feel ignored. They don't feel overlooked. After a certain amount of conversation in which you are genuinely matching your answers to their questions, meeting their levels of expectations, they're going to cool down. And it'll help them have a better day, even if this was a ruling that went sour for them. Right? I think that... no.
I have another question.
No!
Okay.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
So this is kind of related to me. It's a big part of, I think, like making great calls, and it's something we kind of touched on. But I'm interested in your specific thoughts, theories, whatever, on when to separate players.
Sure.
Because I think it's a big thing that's inconsistent across the big program. People are very good at different ways.
Does anybody have a suggestion for when to separate players first? Elliot, and then Ashley.
So a basic rule of thumb that I use is, one, is the call contentious? You need to get players away from each other to calm down and be able to figure out what's happening. Another basic thing is if the players fundamentally disagree on what's happening. If you have both players that are working together to figure out something that went wrong, there's no need to separate them because both of them are actively working towards a solution. But if that's not the case, and you need to compare stories, get one straight without the other person maybe interrupting all the time, or the other person just being mad at something that just happened, then that space becomes a tool that you can use. You want to think of separating the players as a tool to use and not necessarily something that you do all the time.
Cool. So whether the ruling is contentious, and think of it as a tool, not as something punitive. I said Ashley next.
Elliot covered most of what I was going to say. Players are, even if it's something relatively innocuous, like those players are very good at picking up on each other's arguments. And if you don't separate them, now you have to deal with that. That specifically is the reason I just came up with, instead of comparing two stories and seeing which seems most likely.
Yep. I'll take two more, then offer, as requested, my specific thoughts, and then I think we are done like dinner. Steve.
Aside from like contentious things, you can also read. Sometimes somebody has a question about, can I do this, or how do I blah blah blah. They're kind of pointing, but they seem hesitant. If you can read that sometimes it's like you can offer to be like, would you like to talk to me away from the table? That way they can give the full details without having to worry about giving away any information to their opponent, and they may not realize that it's even an option to ask you away from the table.
It's a very good point. We don't always need to separate players because of some conflict or contention between the two players. Tom?
Yep. In situations, much like Elliot described, where you have two players kind of just going at it at one another, where one's like, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, and they think like basically, you're lying,
Mm-hmm.
where there's clearly two different views on reality. I like to separate players there not only to keep them from shouting at each other, but to keep each player's version of events as crystal clear as possible. I don't like situations where I have one player giving their side of the story, and then the opponent uses that to reshape how they're going to explain their side of things to try and get a ruling that they want.
Yep. I would add to that also, building off of what Tom just mentioned, and Elliot also mentioned interruptions. That's one of the things I look for. If I ask one specific player a question, especially if it's an open question for asking their side of what's going on, and the other player responds, especially if they do this a second time. For me, the second time is always the drop dead, I need to hear it from only one person at a time. And if I feel like the mood can handle that, I might do that at the table. Otherwise, I might say, all right, hold on just a moment. Why don't I talk to you away from the table, or however you'd like to approach it, depending on your personal habits, your tableside manner, as it were. But for instance, the second someone else answering what I asked the other person is always say, okay, no, I need to get unobstructed and comfortable communication. And Tom also mentioned not aggressive in the sense of the IPG aggressive behavior, but aggressive like, you're lying, or what, do you think I'm lying? Statements like that get that emotionally charged are also a sign that, all right, the players are having some level, not a catastrophic one, but some level of conflict, and the conflict is going to make it more difficult to get what you need, and also to help make sure that each player individually feels addressed and satisfied with the ruling. That is it. You guys are now free for lunch if you've signed up for it. Thank you very much.
All right, before we leave, real quick, because we